The gates stand unmoving, black iron against a grey London sky, as they have for generations. Beyond them, long corridors stretch in silence, lined with portraits of faces that once ruled half the world. Power lives here, but so do shadows. Every polished floor reflects not just ceremony, but secrets. And somewhere within these walls, choices were made that could never be undone. It begins not with a triumph, but with a quiet fracture. A family stood at the height of an empire so vast it bent the horizon. Their name carried weight across continents, their symbols stamped onto maps, coins, and the lives of millions. Yet inside their own house, loyalty was beginning to splinter. Duty demanded obedience. The heart demanded something else entirely. And when the two collided, the crown itself trembled. What does it mean to rule when the cost is your own freedom? What does it take to preserve a throne when the world around you no longer believes in kings? This is not merely a story of palaces and pageantry. It is a story of reinvention of a dynasty, forced to change its very name to survive, of a crown nearly lost to love, and of a family that learned, again and again, that power is never secure. This is the story of the House of Windsor, a legacy, built on endurance and haunted by sacrifice. Welcome to Dynasty Estates Chronicles, where we bring you fascinating stories of wealth, ambition, and rivalry from the world of the richest families in history. Hero. History. If you're drawn to tales of royal power, grand estates, and the hidden tensions behind noble legacies, this channel is for you. If you enjoyed this story and want more captivating journeys into history's most powerful dynasties, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and click the bell icon so you never miss an update. Join us as we uncover the legacies that shaped the world of old money. Long before the name Windsor was ever spoken with reverence, before it became a symbol etched into the identity of Britain itself, the family that would carry it belonged to a different world, entirely one shaped not by English soil, but by the intricate web of European royalty. Their roots lay in the German duchy of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a place far removed from the misty landscapes of Britain, yet deeply intertwined with its future. In the early 19th century, Europe was not merely a collection of nations, it was a chessboard of bloodlines. Marriages were alliances, and children were investments in power. Few understood this better than Queen Victoria, who ascended the British throne in 1837 at the age of just 18. Young, determined, and deeply conscious of her role, she would go on to shape not only Britain, but the entire royal map of Europe. Her marriage in 1840 to Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was more than a union of two individuals. It was the merging of dynasties. Albert brought with him a German identity, one that would quietly embed itself into the British monarchy. Together, Victoria and Albert built a family that would stretch its influence across continents. Their children married into the royal houses of Germany, Russia, Denmark, and beyond, earning Victoria the title, the grandmother of Europe. Yet, beneath this grand network of alliances lay a subtle tension. Britain, at its core, was fiercely national in spirit. Its people looked to their monarch not merely as a ruler, but as a reflection of their identity. And while Victoria was undeniably British, the lineage she cultivated carried unmistakable foreign roots. As the decades passed, the British Empire expanded to unimaginable heights. By the late 19th century, it controlled vast territories across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The monarchy, though no longer absolute in power, remained a central symbol of unity and authority. Palaces gleamed ceremonious, dazzled. The illusion of permanence was carefully maintained, but history rarely allows such illusions to endure. When Queen Victoria died in 1901, her son ascended the throne as King Edward VII, marking the beginning of a new era. The monarchy continued under the name Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, carrying forward its German heritage without much public concern, at least for a time. Then came the storm. In 1914, Europe descended into the chaos of the First World War. What had once been a network of interconnected royal families now fractured into opposing sides. Cousins found themselves at war with one another. The bonds of blood were no match for the pull of nationalism. In Britain, anti-German sentiment surged with a force that could not be ignored. German names became objects of suspicion. Bus, Nisses changed their identities overnight. Even dachshunds, once fashionable pets, were viewed with hostility. The atmosphere was charged, restless, and increasingly unforgiving. And at the center of it all stood the British royal family bearing a name that now felt dangerously out of place. King George VI, grandson of Queen Victoria, understood the gravity of the situation. He was not a man driven by theatrics, but by duty and pragmatism. He saw clearly what others might have resisted, that survival would require transformation. Not a subtle adjustment, but a decisive break from the past. In 1917, at the height of the war, he made a choice that would redefine the monarchy. With a single proclamation, the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha ceased to exist within Britain. In its place, a new name was born: Windsor. The choice was deliberate, almost poetic. Windsor was unmistakably British, rooted in the ancient castle that had stood for centuries as a symbol of royal continuity. It carried no foreign echo, no hint of divided allegiance. It was, in every sense, a reinvention. We've decided that. We in our house shall be styled and known as the House and Family of Windsor. The words were simple. Their impact was not in that moment. The monarchy did more than change its name. It reshaped its identity. It aligned itself with the people, distancing its image from a past that had become politically dangerous. The crown, once seen as divinely ordained, was now adapting to survive in a world driven by public perception. Yet such reinvention comes at a cost. What does it mean to abandon part of your heritage to preserve your future? What is lost when identity becomes something that can be rewritten at will? For the House of Windsor, the answer was not immediate. The new name brought stability, even renewed trust. The monarchy endured, its image strengthened in the eyes of a nation at war. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The crown had learned that its power was no longer absolute. It depended on acceptance, on approval, on the delicate balance between tradition and transformation. And once that lesson is learned, it cannot be UNLEARNED. This was not merely the birth of a new royal house. It was the beginning of a monarchy that would spend the next century fighting to prove it still belonged. Asterisk, the name had changed, but the danger had not passed. By 1917, Britain was deep within the machinery of war. Trenches carved through the earth of Europe. Cities trembled under the weight of uncertainty, and far from the front lines, the monarchy faced a quieter, but no less significant battle to fight to remain relevant in a world that was beginning to question its very existence. King George, we understood that a new name alone would not secure the future. The House of Windsor could not simply exist. It had to be seen, felt, and believed in. For centuries, monarchs had ruled from a distance, cloaked in ceremony and mystery. Now, distance had become a weakness, so the monarchy stepped forward. George V began reshaping the role of the crown, not as a distant authority, but as a visible symbol of unity. Public appearances increased. Royal engagements were no longer rare. Spectacles. They became frequent reminders that the crown stood alongside its people. The king visited factories, hospitals, and military units, placing himself not above the nation. But within Italiano, it was a subtle shift, but a powerful one. For the first time, the monarchy began to rely not just on tradition, but on connection. The war demanded sacrifice from every corner of British society. Families lost sons. Cities endured hardship. The monarchy, too, needed to reflect that same sense of shared burden. Lavish displays were quietly reduced. The tone of royal life softened. The image of grandeur gave way to one of resilience. But even as the monarchy adapted outwardly, a deeper transformation was taking place. Power, once rooted in divine right, was now tethered to public perception. Could a monarchy truly survive if its authority depended on how it was seen? This question lingered as the war drew to a close in 1918. Britain emerged victorious, but changed. The old world, the one that had sustained unquestioned monarchy, was fading. Across Europe, royal houses were collapsing. The Romanovs in Russia had fallen violently. The German Kaiser had been forced into exile. Thrones that once seemed eternal were disappearing in a matter of months. The Windsors had survived. But survival came with a new understanding. They were no longer untouchable. In the years that followed, the monarchy continued its careful reinvention. George V leaned further into accessibility, presenting himself as a steady, reassuring presence during uncertain times. The crown became less about ruling and more about representing a living symbol of continuity in a rapidly shifting world. Then, in 1932, a new step was taken, one that would bring the monarchy closer to its people than ever before. On Christmas Day, King George V spoke directly to the nation through radio for the first time. His voice, carried across the airwaves, entered homes, living rooms, and quiet spaces where the monarchy had never reached before. I speak now from my home and from my heart to you all. The words were simple, yet their impact was profound. For generations, the monarchy had been seen. Now, it was heard. The distance between crown and country narrowed further. The king was no longer a distant figure in portraits, and ceremoniously was a voice, familiar and human. The broadcast marked a turning point, not just in communication, but in identity. The monarchy was becoming something new, a presence woven into everyday life. And yet, with closeness came risk. The more visible the monarchy became, the more it invited scrutiny. Every action, every decision, every personal detail carried the potential to shape public opinion. The crown had traded invisibility for connection, but in doing so, it had also exposed itself. What happens when the image cracks? By the early 1930s, Britain was facing economic hardship. The Great Depression cast long shadows across the country. Unemployment, rosy confidence, wavered. Once again, the monarchy found itself navigating uncertain ground. George V remained steadfast, offering stability in a time of unrest. His approach was cautious, deliberate. He understood that the monarchy's strength no longer lay in commanding authority, but in maintaining trust. But trust, once made fragile, is never fully secure. Within the royal family itself, a different energy was beginning to emerge. A younger generation, shaped not by the traditions of the past but by the modern world, viewed the crown through a different lens. Among them stood a figure who would soon test the limits of everything the Windsors had rebuilt. Edward, Prince of Wales. Charming, charismatic, unconventional. He represented a new kind of royal, one that connected easily with the public, yet resisted the constraints of duty. Where George V embodied discipline, Edward embodied freedom. And in that contrast lay a quiet, growing tension. The monarchy had spent years redefining itself, carefully balancing tradition with adaptation. It had survived war, reshaped its identity, and drawn closer to the people it served. But it had also become something fragile, dependent on image, vulnerable to perception, exposed in ways that had never been before. And now, standing at the edge of change, the House of Windsor faced a new question, one far more personal than any it had encountered before. What happens when the greatest threat to the crown does not come from war, but from within? The answer was already beginning to unfold. By the late 1920s, the House of Windsor stood as a monarchy that had not only survived but adapted. It had shed its foreign identity, drawn closer to its people, and redefined its role in a modern world that no longer bowed so easily to crowns. On the surface, stability had returned. The image was controlled, the institution intact. But beneath that carefully maintained balance, a new force was rising. Edward, Prince of Wales, moved through this world with a presence that felt entirely different from those before him. Where his father, King George V, had embodied restraint and duty, Edward radiated charm and spontaneity. He was modern in a way the monarchy had never quite allowed itself to be. He smiled easily, spoke freely, and connected with crowds not through distance but through familiarity. The public adored him. He traveled extensively across the empire, visiting Canada, Australia, India, and Africa, carrying with him the image of a monarchy that felt youthful and accessible. Crowds gathered not just out of obligation, but out of genuine excitement. Women wrote letters. Newspapers followed his every movement. He was not merely there, he was a symbol of possibility. And yet, symbols can be deceptive. For all his popularity, Edward viewed the institution he was born into with a quiet resistance. The rituals, the expectations, the rigid structure of royal life, these were not burdens he carried comfortably. Where others saw duty, he often saw constraint. What does it mean to inherit a crown you are not certain you want? This question lingered, unspoken but persistent. Meanwhile, the monarchy itself continued to expand its influence not through conquest, but through presence. The British Empire, though still vast, was beginning to shift in character. It was no longer simply a force of control. It was becoming a network of relationships, bound together by shared history and, increasingly, shared uncertainty. Within this evolving structure, the monarchy served as a unifying thread. Royal tours reinforced loyalty. Ceremonies reaffirmed tradition. Buckingham Palace stood not merely as a residence, but as a symbol its grand facade, representing continuity in a world that seemed to be moving faster with each passing year. Inside its walls, however, the reality was far more complex. The life of a royal was defined by precision. Every appearance was measured. Every word carried weight. The palace itself, with its endless corridors and ornate rooms, was both magnificent and isolating, a place where grandeur masked an absence of freedom. For Edward, this environment felt increasingly suffocating. He sought connection beyond its boundaries, forming relationships that did not fit neatly within the expectations placed upon him. Among these, one would come to define not only his life, but the future of the monarchy itself. Vela Simpson, an American, divorced, independent, entirely outside the world of British royal tradition. Their relationship, at first, existed quietly, almost invisibly, but it carried with it a tension that would soon become impossible to contain. For the monarchy, built so carefully on image and public trust, such a union represented more than personal choice. It was a challenge to the very foundation of what the crown stood for. Yet at this stage, the danger was not fully realized to the public. Edward remained the beloved prince, the modern face of a changing monarchy. His popularity shielded him, at least for a time, from the deeper implications of his choices. The institution continued to function, its influence steady, its authority maintained. But internally, something was beginning to fracture. King George V watched closely. He understood his son in a way few others did. Where the public saw charisma, he saw unpredictability. Where others saw progress, he saw risk. The monarchy, he believed, depended not on popularity alone, but on discipline and the willingness to place duty above all else, a belief Edward did not fully share. In private, George V is said to have expressed his concern with quiet clarity, once remarking that after his death, his son would ruin himself within 12 months. It was not a statement made lightly. It was a reflection of a growing fear that the fragile balance the Windsors had built could be undone from within. And still, the outward image remained untouched. The monarchy continued its steady expansion of influence. Public ceremonies grew in scale. Media coverage increased. The royal family became more visible than ever before, their lives unfolding not just within palace walls, but across newspapers and radio broadcasts. Visibility brought connection, but it also brought exposure. Every decision now carried consequences beyond the private sphere. The crown, once shielded by distance, was now subject to the scrutiny of an entire nation. And in that scrutiny lay a new kind of vulnerability, one that could not be controlled through tradition alone. As the early 1930s unfolded, the world itself grew more uncertain. Economic hardship spread. Political tensions simmered beneath the surface. The stability the monarchy represented became more important than ever. And yet, at the very heart of that stability, a question was quietly taking shape. What happens when the figure meant to embody duty begins to choose something else? Edward's rise had brought the monarchy closer to the people than ever before. He represented a future that felt modern, accessible, even hopeful, but he also carried within him a contradiction, one that would soon demand resolution. A monarchy that had survived by adapting now faced a challenge it could not easily reshape. Because this time, the threat was not external, it was personal. And when the moment came, it would force a choice that could not be undone between the crown and the heart. The House of Windsor had built its survival on reinvention. But not all things can be changed without consequence. Some choices echo far beyond the moment they are made. By 19, the moment had arrived. King George V was gone. The crown had passed, as it always must, to the next in line. Edward, Prince of Wales the Charming, modern heir, was now King Edward VIII. For the public, it felt like the beginning of a new era. A young, confident monarch, deeply admired, stepping into a role that seemed almost tailored to his personality. But behind the ceremony, behind the carefully staged image of continuity, a quiet conflict had already taken root. Wallis Simpson was no longer a distant presence. She stood at the center of Edward's life, immutable, undeniable. Their relationship, once private, was now impossible to conceal. Within palace walls, it was spoken of in hushed tones. Within government circles, it was treated with growing alarm. And beyond Britain's borders, the whispers had already begun to spread. The issue was not merely personal. Wallis Simpson was an American. She had been married and was in the process of divorcing her second husband. As the future queen, she would stand not only beside the king, but within the moral and constitutional framework of the British state. The Church of England, of which the monarch was the supreme governor, could not accept such a union. And so, the question emerged quiet at first, then louder with each passing day. Could a king choose love over duty? Edward did not hesitate. To him, the answer felt simple. What is a crown, if it demands the abandonment of the one person who makes life bearable? What is power, if it requires a kind of loneliness that cannot be escaped? But the monarchy did not operate on simplicity. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin made the position of the government clear. The marriage would not be accepted, not by the church, not by the cabinet, and not by the dominions that formed the wider empire. The crown was not Edward's alone. It belonged to the nation, and the nation was watching. Publicly, the British press remained silent, restrained by convention, but internationally, the story unfolded openly. Across Europe and America, headlines questioned the stability of the British monarchy. The image the Windsors had worked so carefully to rebuild now stood on uncertain ground. And inside Buckingham Palace, the tension grew heavier. Edward found himself increasingly isolated, not just as a king, but as a man. Advisors urged caution. Family members expressed concern. His brother, Albert the Futured, George VI, watched from a distance, aware that whatever choice Edward made would alter not just his own life, but the fate of the entire family. This was no longer a private matter. It was a crisis, and crises demand resolution. In December 1936, the decision came. Not in anger, not in defiance, but with a clarity that carried its own weight. Edward chose love. In a radio broadcast that would echo through history, he spoke to the nation not as a distant monarch, but as a man stepping away from power. Premeta Hubby found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility. Without the help and support of the woman I love, the words were calm, measured, irreversible. With that, King Edward VIII abdicated the throne. The crown passed to his brother, Albert, who would become King George VI. And just like that, the monarchy changed course. But what had truly been lost? The abdication solved the immediate crisis. The institution survived. The crown remained intact, yet beneath that surface of stability lay something far more difficult to repair. Trust had been broken. The king had chosen himself over the role he was meant to embody. A family had been divided by a decision no one could undo, and the monarchy once again had been forced to confront its own fragility. The House of Windsor had endured, but it had paid a price, and the consequences were only just beginning. The crown had been passed, but the weight of what had happened did not disappear with it. In the immediate aftermath of Edward's abdication in December 1936, Britain stood in a state of quiet disbelief. The transition had been swift, almost clinical. One day, there was a king. The next, there was another. Officially, the machinery of monarchy had functioned as it was designed to do, seamless, controlled, uninterrupted. But beneath that surface, the rupture was profound. Albert, Duke of York, now King George VI, was not a man who had ever sought the throne. Where Edward had embraced attention, Albert had spent much of his life avoiding it, reserved, deeply private, and burdened by a severe stammer. He lacked the natural ease that his brother had displayed so effortlessly. And yet, it was he who now stood at the center of a nation in need of stability. The contrast could not have been sharper. Edward had been the future, the public, imagined modern, charismatic, unrestrained. George VI represented something else entirely: duty, restraint, and a quiet determination that did not announce itself, but endured. Still, the transition was not without strain. Within the royal family, the emotional cost was immediate. Edward, now styled the Duke of Windsor, had not simply stepped away from the throne, he had stepped away from his place within the family's inner circle. His decision, though framed as personal, had forced those closest to him into roles they had neither expected nor prepared for George VI. The burden was immense. He had inherited not only a crown, but a crisis of confidence. The monarchy, though intact, had been exposed. The idea that a king could abandon his role for personal desire lingered in the public consciousness, unsettling the very foundation upon which royal authority rested. Could the monarchy still be trusted to place duty above all else? This question hovered in the background, unspoken yet persistent. George VI understood what was at stake. He approached his new role not with ambition, but with a sense of obligation that bordered on sacrifice. Every speech, every appearance, every decision carried the weight of restoring faith not just in himself, but in the institution he now represented. And yet even as he stepped into this role, he carried his own private struggle. His speech impediment, something he had battled since childhood, became more than a personal challenge. It became a national concern. A king must speak. A king must lead. And in an age of radio, where the voice of the monarch reached directly into the homes of millions, clarity was not a luxury, it was essential. Each public address became an act of quiet courage. Behind the scenes, he worked tirelessly to overcome his limitations, guided by his speech therapist, Lionel Logue. The process was slow, often frustrating, but it reflected something deeper about George VI. Willingness to confront weakness, not conceal it. In a time when the monarchy needed authenticity as much as authority, meanwhile, Edward's presence did not fade as cleanly as the official narrative suggested. Though removed from power, he remained a figure of fascination. His marriage to Violet Simpson in 1937, held in France without the attendance of the royal family, underscored the distance that had grown between him and the institution he once led. The decision not to grant Violet the title of Her Royal Highness further cemented that divide. but unmistakable line. Edward had chosen love, but in doing so, he had lost something far more enduring. Not just a crown, but a place within the structure that defined his identity. And yet, the tension did not end there for George VI. The shadow of his brother lingered. Edward's abdication was not simply an event of the past, it was a constant reminder of how fragile the monarchy could be. Every step forward was measured against the risk of another fracture. Externally, the world was growing darker. By the late 1930s, Europe once again edged toward conflict. The rise of Nazi Germany, the collapse of diplomatic stability, the sense that war was approaching, all of it placed new pressure on Britain and its leadership. The monarchy, still recovering from internal disruption, now faced an external threat. Of unprecedented scale, and peacetime there would be no room for uncertainty. George VI had to become more than a symbol. He had to become a source of strength. The question was no longer whether the monarchy could survive scandal. It was whether it could withstand war. In this new reality, the lessons of the abdication took on a sharper edge. Duty was no longer an abstract. Expiation, it was a necessity. The crown could not falter again. The consequences would be far greater than embarrassment or public doubt. They would be national. As Britain moved closer to the brink, the monarchy stood at a critical point in its evolution. It had endured betrayal. It had adapted to survive, but it had also been reshaped in ways that could not be undone. The relationship between crown and country had changed. It was no longer built on distance, but on trust. And trust, once broken, demands proof before it can be restored. George VI would spend the coming years offering that proof, not through grand declarations, but through steady presence, through endurance, through sacrifice. But even as the monarchy began to stabilize once more, the internal costs of what had happened remained. A brother lost to exile, a king burdened by expectation, a family divided by a choice that could never be reversed. The crown had been saved, but it had not come without consequence. And as history would soon reveal, the true test of that sacrifice was still to come. Asterisk, the monarchy had survived the abdication. But survival, as the House of Windsor was beginning to understand, was not the same as acceptance. In the years that followed 1936, the crown faced a quieter, more complex battle, not one fought with declarations or ceremonies, but with perception. The institution remained intact, yet its image had been altered. The illusion of unshakable duty had fractured, replaced by something far more fragile, a need to prove itself worthy of the people's trust. And trust, once shaken, is never easily restored. King George VI stepped into this uncertain space with a determination that did not seek admiration, but stability. He did not attempt to replace his brother's charisma. Cooled not. Instead, he offered something else, something less dazzling, but perhaps more enduring. Consistency. His reign, from the outset, became an exercise in quiet reassurance. Every appearance, every speech, every carefully measured gesture was part of a larger effort to rebuild the monarchy's standing. He understood that legitimacy was no longer inherited, had to be demonstrated. Yet the challenge extended beyond. Britain. The monarchy was not merely a national institution. It stood at the center of an empire that stretched across continents. Canada, Australia, India, South Africa each looked to the crown as a symbol of unity. But unity itself was beginning to shift. The empire was no longer unquestioned. National identities were strengthening. Independence movements were gaining momentum. What did the crown represent in a world that was slowly moving beyond it? This question lingered in diplomatic exchanges, in public sentiment, and in the quiet evolution of global politics. The monarchy had to navigate not only internal doubt, but external change, a balancing act between tradition and transformation. Within Britain, the role of the royal family became increasingly visible. Public engagement was no longer optional. It was essential. The Windsors appeared at factories, hospitals, and community gatherings. reinforcing the idea that they were not separate from the nation, but part of Italiano. It was a carefully constructed image. But beneath it, the reality was more complicated. The life of a royal, already constrained by duty, became even more restrictive in the wake of the abdication. The margin for personal choice narrowed. Expectations tightened. Every member of the family carried, in some way, the weight of what had happened. Nowhere was this more evident than in the figure of Queen Elizabeth, the wife of George VI. Where her husband struggled with the burdens of kingship, she became a pillar of strength, composed, resilient, unwavering. Her presence brought a sense of calm that the monarchy desperately needed. She understood instinctively what was required: visibility, empathy, and above all, steadfastness. Together, they began to reshape the public perception of the crown, not as distant rulers, but as a family. It was a subtle shift, yet profoundly important. The monarchy was no longer defined solely by its authority, but by its ability to connect to, reflect the values and struggles of the people it represented. And then, in 1939, the world changed again. The outbreak of the Second World War transformed the stakes entirely. This was no longer a question of reputation or perception. It was a test of survival, both for the nation and for the institution that symbolized it. Britain entered the war under the leadership of Prime Minister Winston Churchill, but the monarchy played a role that extended beyond politics. It became a source of morale, a symbol of endurance in the face of unprecedented hardship. And crucially, it chose to remain dot. As German bombers targeted London during the Blitz, Buckingham Palace itself was struck. The damage was visible, undeniable. The seat of monarchy, once a symbol of untouchable grandeur, now bore the scars of war alongside the city it represented. It was a defining moment. Queen Elizabeth, later known as the Queen Mother, captured its significance in words that resonated deeply with the public. The children won't go without me. I won't leave the king. And the king will never leave. The message was clear. The monarchy would not retreat. While other European royal families fled into exile, the Windsors stayed. They shared the risks of their people. They endured the same uncertainty, the same danger, and in doing so, they transformed the perception of the crown in a way no proclamation ever could. This was no longer an institution demanding loyalty, it was one earning. A King George VI's wartime broadcasts became moments of national unity. His voice, once uncertain, now carried a different kind of strength, not in perfection, but in perseverance. Each speech reflected not just leadership, but the visible struggle of a man determined to fulfill a role he had never sought. And the public responded. The monarchy, once questioned, began to regain its place in the national consciousness, not as an outdated relic, but as a living symbol of resilience. Yet even in this renewal, there were contradictions. The very visibility that strengthened the monarchy also bounded more tightly to public expectation. The family's private lives became increasingly intertwined with their public roles. Personal identity and public duty blurred into one continuous performance. For the younger generation, this would carry lasting consequences. Among them was Princess Elizabeth, the future Queen Elizabeth II. During the war, she stepped beyond the sheltered confines of royal life, joining the Auxiliary Territorial Service in 1945. She trained as a driver, a mechanic, an image that resonated powerfully with the public. Here was a princess, not removed from the realities of war, but participating in them. It was symbolic. A monarchy that worked. A monarchy that served. But also a monarchy that demanded early sacrifice. For Elizabeth, as for others within the family, duty was no longer a concept introduced later in life. It was immediate, unavoidable, woven into the fabric of her identity from a young age. And so, as the war came to an end in 1945, the House of Windsor stood, transformed once again. It had faced internal collapse and survived, it had faced global conflict and endured. It had moved from a position of inherited authority to one of earned respect. But in doing so, it had also redefined the very nature of what it meant to belong to the crown. The monarchy was no longer sustained by distance or mystique. It was sustained by performance, by expectation, by the constant need to prove its relevance in a world that no longer required it. And within that shift lay a quiet and doringos, because once a family becomes an institution, once every choice carries national consequence, there is no return to ordinary life. The battle for Stas had been won. The monarchy had secured its place in the modern world, but it had done so by binding itself more tightly than ever to the demands of that world. And those demands, as history would soon reveal, would only grow more relentless. The moment came quietly. In February 1952, far from the grand halls of Buckingham Palace, a young princess stood beneath the African sky in Kenya. The air was still, the landscape vast and unfamiliar. She had arrived as the daughter of a king. By the time the news reached her, she was no longer simply that. King George VI was dead, and Elizabeth, at Hoost's, 25 years old, had become queen. There was no preparation for this exact moment, only the slow shaping of a life that had always been moving towards it. From childhood, she had understood that her path was not her own. Duty had been introduced early, not as a burden, but as an expectation that quietly defined everything. Yet expectation and reality are never quite the same. What does it mean to inherit a crown at an age when most are still discovering who they are? The journey back to Britain was no longer a return, it was an arrival into a role that could not be set aside. When Elizabeth stepped onto British soil, she did so not as a daughter in mourning, but as a monarch in waiting. The transition was immediate. Personal grief gave way to public responsibility. There was no pause in the months that followed. The scale of what she had inherited became increasingly clear. Britain was no longer the empire it had once been. The war had left its mark economically, strained, politically shifting, socially changing. Across the world, colonies were beginning to seek independence. The idea of empire, once a cornerstone of British identity, was beginning to dissolve. And at the center of this transformation stood a young queen. Her coronation in 1953 was designed not merely as a ceremony, but as a statement, held in Westminster Abbey. It carried the weight of tradition's centuries-old rituals, sacred oaths, symbols of continuity that reached back through time. Yet it was also something entirely new. For the first time, the coronation was televised. Millions watched. Homes across Britain and beyond gathered around flickering screens, witnessing an event that had once been reserved for those physically present. The monarchy, once defined by distance, was now entering the living rooms of ordinary people. It was a turning point. Elizabeth understood, perhaps instinctively, what this meant. The crown could no longer rely solely on tradition. It had to exist within the modern world, accessible, yet still rooted in its history. During the ceremony, she made a promise that echoed far beyond the walls of the abbey. I will, to the utmost of my power, maintain the laws of God and the true profession of the gospel. The words were formal, steeped in tradition, but beneath them lay something more personal, a commitment. Not just a rule. Batu Nduri. The early years of her reign were marked by this quiet determination. She traveled extensively across the Commonwealth, reinforcing connections that were no longer defined by control, but by cooperation. The British Empire was transforming into the Commonwealth of Nations, a network bound not by authority, but by shared history. It was a delicate transition, and one that required careful navigation at home. The monarchy continued to evolve. The royal family became more present, more engaged with public life. Appearances, tours, and ceremonies were no longer simply expressions of tradition. They were tools of relevance. Yet with every step towards visibility, the line between public role and private life grew thinner. For Elizabeth, tis Langwold, never fully separate. Her identity as a woman, as a wife, as a mother all existed alongside her role as queen. But the crown always came first. It had to. The lessons of the past had made that clear. The monarchy could not afford another fracture, another moment where personal desire overshadowed duty. And so, from the very beginning, her reign was defined by a single, unspoken understanding. There would be no abdication, no deviation, no retreat. The young queen did not challenge the system she inherited. She became Italiano, and in doing so, she ensured its survival. But survival, as history had already shown, is never without cost. The stage had been set. The monarchy had entered a new era, one shaped not by empire, but by exposure. And in that exposure, new challenges were already beginning to form. Asterisk. The crown had entered the modern world, but the modern world was not gentle. As the 1950s gave way to the 1960s and beyond, the carefully balanced identity of the monarchy began to face pressures unlike anything it had encountered before. The changes were not sudden. They unfolded gradually, quiet shifts in politics, society, and culture that over time began to reshape the ground beneath the throne. The British Empire, once the foundation of royal influence, was dissolving. Nation after nation moved towards independence. India had already broken away in 1947. Across Africa and the Caribbean, the same pattern followed. What had once been an empire governed from London was becoming something looser, less certain the Commonwealth. For Queen Elizabeth II, this was not simply a political transformation, it was a redefinition of purpose. If the monarchy no longer stood at the center of a global empire, then what did it represent? What bound these nations together, if not authority? The answer, carefully constructed over time, was symbolism. The Queen became the head of the Commonwealth not as a ruler, but as a figure of continuity. Her role shifted from command to connection, from authority to presence. Royal tours continued, but their meaning had changed. They were no longer demonstrations of power, they were gestures of unity. Yet even as the monarchy adapted externally, a different challenge was emerging closer to home. The rise of mass media, television, newspapers, and later global broadcasting began to reshape the relationship between the royal family and the public. Information traveled faster. Images reached further. The monarchy, once filtered through ceremony and distance, was now exposed in ways it had never been before. Visibility became constant, and constant visibility invites scrutiny. Every gesture, every expression, every moment interpreted, analyzed, repeated. The crown, once shielded by tradition, now existed under a lens that never fully turned away. Could an institution built on mystique survive in an age that demanded transparency? In 1969, a decision was made that would test this question more directly than ever before. The documentary Royal Family. For the first time, cameras were allowed into the private spaces of the monarchy. The public saw moments that had previously been hidden. Conversations, ordinary interactions within an extraordinary household. The intention was clear: to humanize the royal family, to make them relatable, to strengthen the bond between crown and country. And for a time, it worked. Viewers were fascinated. The monarchy felt closer, more familiar. The distance that had once defined it seemed to dissolve. But with that closeness came an unintended consequence. The illusion of separation, the idea that the monarchy existed on a different plane, began to weaken. What happens when a symbol becomes too ordinary? The very access that made the monarchy more relatable also made it more vulnerable. Familiarity, once established, invites judgment. The public no longer saw only ceremony, they saw individuals. And individuals can be questioned in ways symbols cannot. This tension grew steadily. In the years that followed by the 1970s and 1980s, Britain itself was changing. Social norms shifted. deference to authority declined. The unquestioned respect that had once surrounded institutions, including the monarchy, began to erode. The public voice grew louder, more critical, less willing to accept tradition without examination. The royal family, now firmly within the public eye, could not escape this shift. Internally, the pressures began to take their toll. The expectations placed upon each member of the family were immense. They were required to embody tradition, yet adapt to change, to remain dignified, yet appear accessible, to represent stability, while living lives that were anything but ordinary. This contradiction created strain. Private challenges became public narratives. Relationships, on Cecile dead, now unfolded under constant observation. The boundary between duty and personal life, already thin, became almost invisible. For Queen Elizabeth II, the task remained the same: to hold the institution together. She maintained a steady, unwavering presence, rarely revealing emotion, rarely stepping beyond the role she had committed to so completely. Her strength lay in consistency, in the ability to endure without visible fracture. But endurance, too, has its limits. The monarchy had spent decades adapting to survive. It had embraced visibility, accepted scrutiny, and redefined its place in a changing world. Yet with each adaptation, it had also surrendered something: distance, mystique, control. By allowing the public closer, it had invited them not only to admire but to judge, and judgment, once invited, cannot be easily contained. As the late 20th century approached, the monarchy stood at another critical threshold. It remained powerful in symbolism, deeply embedded in national identity, but it was also more exposed than ever before. Its strengths, visible, but so too its vulnerabilities. The question was no longer whether the crown could adapt, it was whether it could withstand the consequences of that adaptation. Because in the years ahead, those consequences would arrive with a force that no amount of preparation could fully contain. And when they did, the monarchy would face a moment from which it could not simply recover. It would have to transform. By the early 1980s, the Monarchy stood at what appeared to be another moment of renewal. The world watched as a young prince prepared to marry Prince Charles, heir to the throne, had spent years under quiet scrutiny, his role defined, his future predetermined. But now, with the announcement of his engagement to Lady Diana Spencer in 1981, the narrative shifted. Diana was young, graceful, and seemingly untouched by the burdens of royal life. To the public, she represented something almost mythical: innocence meeting tradition, youth breathing life into an ancient institution. The wedding, held at Este Paules Cathedral on the 29th of July 1981, was nothing short of spectacle. An estimated global audience of over 750 million people watched as Diana stepped into a world that few could truly understand. The dress shimmered. The ceremony echoed with history. The monarchy, once again, appeared untouchable, resplendent, united, enduring. But appearances can conceal what lies beneath. From the beginning, there were factors subtle at first, almost invisible beneath the weight of expectation. Charles carried a past that had not been resolved. His long-standing relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles lingered quietly, shaping the emotional landscape of a marriage that the public believed to be perfect. Diana, meanwhile, found herself navigating a reality far removed from the image presented to the world. The palace, with its grandeur and ritual, offered little comfort in moments of isolation. Every movement was observed, every expression interpreted. The life she had entered demanded not just presence, but performance. What happens when a fairy tale is expected to remain perfect, even when it begins to break? As the years passed, the cracks widened. Publicly, the couple fulfilled their roles, appearing together at events, representing the monarchy with the grace expected of them. Privately, however, the distance between them grew. Misunderstandings deepened into resentment. Silence gave way to conflict. By the late 1980s, the marriage had begun to unravel in ways that could no longer be contained. The media, already attuned to the rhythms of royal life, began to sense the shift. Stories emerged tentative at first, then increasingly direct. The monarchy, once able to manage its image with careful control, now faced a media landscape that was relentless, persistent, and global. In 1992, the separation of Charles and Diana was officially announced. It was a moment that carried weight far beyond the relationship itself. This was not merely the breakdown of a marriage, it was the fracture of an image the monarchy had carefully constructed. The idea of unity, of stability within the royal family, began to erode, and then came the revelations. Private conversations were exposed. Personal details, once unthinkable to share, became public knowledge. The boundaries that had once protected the monarchy dissolved almost entirely. The institution that had adapted to visibility now found itself overwhelmed by it. In 1995, Diana gave an interview that would alter everything. Sitting before the BBC cameras, she spoke not with restraint, but with clarity. Her words, measured yet undeniably powerful. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. In that single sentence, the private became public. The illusion shattered. The monarchy, long sustained by its ability to control narrative, now faced a reality where narrative was no longer its own to shape. Public sympathy shifted. Diana became not just a princess, but a figure of vulnerability, human, relatable, deeply affected by the very institution she had once seemed to elevate. For Queen Elizabeth II, this was a moment of profound challenge. The stability she had maintained for decades was now under threat, not from external forces, but from within her own family. The monarchy's image, already strained, began to fracture under the weight of scandal and public scrutiny. In 1996, the divorce of Charles and Diana was FIA. NAL. It marked the end of a relationship, but not the end of its impact. If anything, the consequences were only beginning to unfold. Because the public had seen too much. They had witnessed the vulnerability, the conflict, the humanity behind the crown, and once that veil is lifted, it cannot easily be restored. Then came the moment no one could have anticipated. On the 31st of August 1997, Diana, Princess of Wales, died in a car accident in Paris. The news spread with a speed and intensity that reflected the world she had come to inhabit. Shock turned to grief. Grief turned to something deeper, an outpouring of emotion that transcended borders, cultures, and expectations. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace. Flowers covered the gates. Silence filled the spaces where ceremony once dominated. And in that silence, a question emerged. Where was the monarchy? In the immediate aftermath, the Queen remained at Balmoral with her family, prioritizing privacy, shielding Diana's sons from the full force of public attention. It was a decision rooted in personal instinct, but one that was not immediately understood. The public expected presence. They expected acknowledgement. And in its absence, criticism grew. The monarchy, already under pressure, now faced a moment that demanded something it had rarely shown: visible emotion. This was the point of no return. Not because of a single event, but because of what it revealed. The gap between tradition and expectation had widened beyond what could be ignored. For the first time in her reign, Queen Elizabeth II addressed the nation directly in response to a deeply personal tragedy. Speaking from Buckingham Palace, she acknowledged Diana not just as a public figure, but as a person offering a rare glimpse of emotion that resonated across the country. It was a moment of adaptation, of necessity. The monarchy, once divined by its distance, was now required to respond with immediacy, with visibility, with humanity, and it did, but not without cost. The events of the 1980s and 1990s reshaped the monarchy in ways that could not be undone. The institution survived as it had before. It adapted as it always had. Yet something fundamental had changed. The illusion of perfection, the carefully maintained image of unity and stability, had been replaced by something more complex, more fragile, more real. The public no longer saw only the crown. They saw the people beneath it. And with that visibility came a new reality, one where the monarchy would be judged not just by tradition, but by its ability to reflect the emotions, expectations, and values of the world around it. The House of Windsor had reached a threshold. Beyond it lay a future that could not rely solely on history. It would have to be earned again. Asterisk. The storm had passed, but its echoes remained. By the dawn of the 21st century, the House of Windsor stood not as it once had, untouchable, unquestioned, but as something more complex. It had endured scandal, loss, and a profound shift in public perception. The monarchy had not fallen, but it had been changed. And now, it had to decide what kind of institution it would become. For Queen Elizabeth II, this period marked a quiet reckoning. She had reigned for decades, guided by a principle that had rarely wavered: duty above all else. Yet the events surrounding Princess Diana's death had revealed a truth that could no longer be ignored. Duty alone was no longer enough. The monarchy needed to be understood. In the years that followed, subtle changes began to emerge, not dramatic, not abrupt, but deliberate. The Queen adjusted the tone of the institution, allowing glimpses of emotion where once there had been restraint. Public statements became more responsive. Engagement with the media, though still carefully controlled, grew more strategic. It was not a reinvention in name, as it had been in 1917. It was a reinvention in approach. What does it mean to lead when the world no longer accepts distance as strength? The monarchy began to answer that question through action. Moments that once would have remained private were now acknowledged publicly. Tragedies were met with visible response. Celebrations were shared more openly. The royal family, long defined by formality, began to adopt a tone that felt more human, more aligned with the expectations of a society that valued authenticity over tradition alone. Yet even as these changes took shape, the internal challenges did not disappear. If anything, they evolved. The next generation of royals grew up in a world entirely different from the one Elizabeth had inherited. Media was no longer limited to newspapers and television. It was immediate, constant, global. Public opinion formed and shifted in real time. Every action, every word, carried the potential to be amplified, dissected, and judged within moments. The pressure was relentless. Prince Charles, who had once stood at the center of controversy, now faced the task of redefining his own public image. His relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles, once a source of scandal, gradually moved towards acceptance. Their marriage in 2005 marked a moment that years earlier would have seemed impossible. It was another sign of adaptation. Another quiet shift in what the monarchy could allow itself to become. But not all tensions resolved so smoothly. Within the family, the weight of expectation continued to shape lives in ways that were often unseen. Princes William and Harry, having grown up under intense public scrutiny, carried forward both the legacy of the crown and the memory of their mother. Their paths, though shared in origin, began to diverge in ways that reflected deeper questions about identity, duty, and freedom. For William, the future king, the role was clear. For Harry, it was not. These differences would later surface in ways that echoed earlier. Fractures within the family remind us that the tension between personal desire and institutional duty had never truly disappeared. It had only changed form. Through it all, Queen Elizabeth II remained the center of gravity. Her presence provided continuity in a world that seemed to move faster with each passing year. She did not seek to dominate the narrative. She did not respond to every criticism. Instead, she maintained a steady course, allowing time, consistency, and quiet adaptation to reshape the monarchy's place in modern life. Her strength was not in transformation alone. It was in endurance, and yet, even endurance carries its own form of struggle. To maintain an institution across decades of change requires more than resilience, it requires sacrifice. Personal expression must be measured. Emotion must be controlled. Identity must often be secondary to role. For Elizabeth, this was not a burden she spoke of. It was one she carried. As the years progressed, moments of reflection became more visible, not through words, but through presence. Jubilees marked the passage of time. Public celebrations honored longevity, stability, and continuity. The monarchy, once shaken, now appeared steady once more. But beneath that steadiness lay a deeper truth. Every adaptation had come at a cost. Every survival had required compromise, and every compromise had shaped not only the institution but the individuals within it. The final battles of this era were not fought in public disputes or dramatic confrontations. They were quieter. Internal balancing of past and future, of tradition and change, of duty and identity. The monarchy had learned to respond. But the question remained, could it continue to evolve without losing the very essence that defined it? That answer, as always, would not come in a single moment. It would inevitably through the lives that followed. Asterisk, there are places where history does not simply exist. It lingers. Buckingham Palace is one of them. Rising from the heart of London, its grand facade of pale stone stands as both residence and symbol. Its balconies and gates framing moments that have defined generations. To the world, it represents continuity, ceremony, tradition, the unbroken thread of monarchy. But to those within its walls, it has always been something more complex. A stage, a sanctuary, and at times, a silent witness. The palace is not always what it is today. Originally built in 1703 as Buckingham House for the Duke of Buckingham, became a royal residence in 1761 when King George III acquired it for Queen Charlotte. Over time, it expanded, transformed, and evolved into the central symbol of British monarchy. By the reign of Queen Victoria, it had become the official royal palace, its rooms filled not just with furniture and art, but with the weight of expectation. Every corridor tells a story. Every room holds memory. Staterooms, adorned with gold leaf and chandeliers, have hosted leaders from across the world, presidents, kings, and dignitaries who passed beneath ceilings, painted with scenes of triumph and legacy. Outside, the changing of the guard unfolds with precise choreography, a ritual that appears unchanged even as the world beyond continues to shift. These rituals matter. They are not merely performances, but anchors, symbols that remind the public of something stable in a world that rarely stands still. And yet, symbols are only as powerful as the belief behind them. Throughout the reign of Elizabeth II, Buckingham Palace became more than a residence. It became a focal point of national identity. During moments of celebration, its balcony transformed into a stage where the royal family stood before the public, visible yet distant, connected yet elevated. Weddings, jubilees, national victories, each moment reinforced the idea that the monarchy remained a constant presence. But just as it hosted celebration, it also bore witness to grief. In September 1997, following the death of Princess Diana, the gates of Buckingham Palace were covered in flowers, thousands upon thousands, laid by ordinary people who came not out of obligation, but emotion. The palace, once a symbol of distance, became a place of collective mourning. For a brief moment, its meaning shifted. It was no longer just a seat of power. It was a place of human connection. This duality between grandeur and intimacy, the monarchy's evolving identity. The very spaces that projected authority also became spaces where vulnerability could be seen, if only briefly. Beyond Buckingham Palace, other royal residences carried their own symbolism. Windsor Castle, older and more fortified, stood as a reminder of endurance its stone walls, having witnessed nearly 1,000 years of history. Sandringham and Balmoral offered something quieter retreats from public life, where the monarchy could exist, however briefly, as a family rather than an institution. But even these private spaces were never entirely separate. The crown follows, wherever it goes. Over time, the monarchy learned to use these symbols not only as markers of tradition, but as tools of connection. Ceremonies such as trooping the color, marking the sovereign's official birthday, became moments of national unity, precision, color, and history woven together into a single display. State openings of Parliament reinforced the constitutional role of the monarch, blending ritual with governance in a way that few institutions could replicate. These events, repeated year after year, created a rhythm, a sense of continuity. Continuity, too, must evolve. In 2012, during the London Olympics, the monarchy embraced something unexpected. In a short film that opened the Games, Queen Elizabeth II appeared alongside the fictional character James Bond, portrayed by Daniel Craig. Together, they seemed to depart Buckingham Palace by helicopter, culminating in a dramatic arrival at the Olympic Stadium. It was a moment that surprised the world. Playful, modern, unscripted in tone, yet carefully considered. For a monarch who had long embodied restraint, this brief departure from tradition carried significance. It showed a willingness to engage with contemporary culture, to meet the public, not only through ceremony, but through shared experience. It was, in its own way, a quiet evolution. Symbols do not remain powerful by resisting change. They remain powerful by adapting. And yet, even as the monarchy embraced these moments of connection, the contrast between public image and private reality remained. The palaces, with their grandeur and history, represented permanence, but the lives within them were shaped by something far less stable: scrutiny and the constant negotiation between role and identity. For those who lived there, the walls did not merely protect. They confined. Every room, no matter how opulent, carried the knowledge that life within it was never entirely one's own. Decisions were rarely personal. Relationships were never entirely private. The very spaces that symbolized power also enforced its demands. This contradiction between what is seen and what is lived became part of the monarchy's enduring narrative. The public saw tradition. The family lived obligation. Over time, the monarchy's ability to maintain this balance became one of its defining strengths. It allowed the institution to remain relevant, to connect across generations, to present itself as both timeless and responsive. But it also required constant awareness. Every symbol had to be maintained. Every moment had to be measured. Because, in a world that no longer accepted authority without question, perception became everything. And perception, once shaped, must be sustained. As the 21st century progressed, the monarchy continued to rely on its symbols, its palaces, its ceremonies, its carefully constructed image to reinforce its place in modern society. These were not relics of the past, but living elements of a system that had learned to evolve. Yet even as these symbols endured, the reality beneath them remained unchanged. The crown still demanded sacrifice. The institution still required conformity, and the line between public role and private life remained as thin as ever. Buckingham Palace still stood. Its gates still opened. Its balconies still framed moments of history. But within its walls, the same question lingered, quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore. What does it truly cost to live a life defined not by choice, but by duty? Time, more than any force, reveals what power cannot hide. By the early decades of the 21st century, the House of Windsor remained standing, visible, recognized, woven into the identity of Britain. Yet beneath that enduring presence, subtle signs of strain had begun to emerge, not dramatic enough to signal collapse, but persistent enough to suggest that the monarchy was once again entering a period of uncertainty. The world had changed, and this time, the change was relentless. The rise of digital media transformed not only how information was shared, but how it was judged. The monarchy, once filtered through controlled narratives, now existed within a constant stream of commentary. Every action, every silence, every perceived misstep was examined instantly, often without context or restraint. The crown could no longer control its image. It could only respond to it. Within this environment, new challenges surfaced, ones that echoed the past, yet carried a distinctly modern weight. In 2019, allegations surrounding Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, brought renewed scrutiny to the royal family. His association with controversial figures and subsequent public interview, intended to clarify his position, instead intensified criticism. The monarchy, already accustomed to navigating public opinion, now faced a situation that demanded clear distance. And distance, once again, came at a cost. Prince Andrew stepped back from public duties. Titles were quietly removed. The institution acted not with spectacle, but with necessity. The message was clear. Survival required separation from anything that threatened the integrity of the crown. It was a familiar patterned adaptation through sacrifice. Yet the most profound shift came not from scandal alone, but from choice. In 2020, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle announced their decision to step back from their roles as senior members of the royal family. The decision, unprecedented in its modern form, echoed faintly of the past of another royal who had chosen a life beyond the expectations of the crown. But this was different. This was not abdication of a throne. It was a rejection of a system. Their departure highlighted tensions that had long existed beneath the surface questions of identity, autonomy, and the pressures of a life lived under constant scrutiny. The monarchy, once again, faced a familiar dilemma. How much freedom can exist within an institution built on duty? The answer, as before, was not simple. Harry and Meghan's departure reshaped the public conversation around the monarchy. It broke into focus the human cost of royal life, the weight of expectation, the loss of privacy, the difficulty of existing, as both individual and symbol. For some, it raised sympathy. For others, criticism. For the monarchy itself, it reinforced the truth it had long known, but rarely acknowledged openly. Not everyone can remain within its walls. As these challenges unfolded, the figure who had held the institution steady for decades remained at its center. Queen Elizabeth II. Her presence, constant and unwavering, continued to provide a sense of continuity. Through jubilees, public addresses, and quiet appearances, she embodied stability in a world that seemed increasingly uncertain. Her Platinum Jubilee in 2022 marked 70 years on the throne, a milestone few had imagined, a testament to endurance that transcended politics, scandal, and time itself. But even endurance has an end. On the 8th of September 2022, Queen Elizabeth II died at Balmoral Castle. The moment was immediate, yet monumental across Britain and the world. The response was one of reflection and acknowledgement, not just of a monarch's passing, but of the closing of an era. For many, she had been a constant presence throughout their lives. Her death marked a transition not only in leadership, but in identity. The crown passed, as it always does, to King Charles III. His ascension carried both continuity and uncertainty. Unlike his mother, whose reign began in youth, Charles came to the throne after decades of preparation, years shaped by public scrutiny, personal challenge, and the evolving expectations of the role he would one day inherit. He stepped forward, not into a stable world, but into one still questioning the place of monarchy itself. The institution he now leads is not the same as the one Elizabeth inherited in 1952. It is more visible, more SERUTINISED. More fragile, public support, though present, is no longer unquestioned. Debates around relevance, cost, and purpose continue to surface, particularly among younger generations who view tradition through a different lens. And yet, the monarchy endures. Not because it has remained unchanged, but because it has adapted again and again to the demands placed upon it. Still, adaptation does not prevent decline. It only reshapes it. The influence of the monarchy, once global and commanding, is now largely symbolic. Its authority exists not in governance, but in representation. Its power lies not in control, but in perception. And perception, as history has shown, is never fixed. The House of Windsor stands today at a familiar crossroads. Between tradition and change, between expectation and reality, between survival and relevance. It has weathered crises before, abdications, scandals, loss. Each time, it has emerged altered, yet intact. But each transformation leaves its mark. The institution remains. The symbols endure. The crown continues to pass from one generation to the next. Yet beneath that continuity lies a quieter truth. The monarchy has not escaped decline. It has learned to live within it. And in doing so, it has ensured its survival, at least for now. Asterisk. In the end, the story of the House of Windsor is not one of uninterrupted triumph. It is a story of survival. Across more than a century, the monarchy has faced moments that could have ended it. Scandal, betrayal, and a world that steadily moved away from the very idea of inherited power. And yet, it remains. Not unchanged, not untouched, but still standing. How? Not through strength alone, but through adaptation. The Windsors learned, again and again, that power could not be held in its original form. It had to be reshaped, softened, redefined. A German dynasty became an English one. A distant monarchy became a visible presence. An institution built on mystique learned to live under scrutiny. Each transformation preserved the crown, but each demanded something in return. What was gained is easy to see. Asterisk. Continuity. Recognition. A place in modern society that many royal houses lost long ago. The monarchy remains a symbol of history, of identity, of something enduring in a world that rarely allows permanence. But what was lost is quieter, less visible, and perhaps more lasting. Personal freedom, surrendered in the name of duty. Relationships strained beneath expectation. Individuals shaped not by who they are, but by what they must represent. From Edward's abdication to Diana's isolation, from silent endurance to public fracture, the cost of the crown has never been shared equally. It has been carried, often alone. Buckingham Palace still stands. Its gates still open to ceremony, to celebration, to moments that appear timeless. But behind those walls, the reality has always been more complicated, more human. Because the crown is not worn by history, it is worn by people, and people, no matter how powerful, are never immune to sacrifice. The House of Windsor secured its legacy. It preserved the throne, but in doing so, it revealed the truth that echoes through every generation. Power can be inherited, but the cost of holding it must always be paid.